class, and welcome to School Online. This is quite the adventure, isn't it? There's a lot that we're learning here and trying, and so if there's ever a time that you have questions or concerns, please do not hesitate to let me know. We're going to be getting into a new unit. We're continuing with Paul's letters, and so we've talked about how Paul structured his letters. We had a unit on that, and we also just went through Romans. And so we're going to be talking about 1 Corinthians today, and particularly 1 and 2 Corinthians kind of together. Each of them have their own sort of perspectives, and they have certain key chapters in these. But today we're going to mostly focus on the background of Corinth itself as a city, the city and the church that Paul is writing to at that time. So in the time of Paul, Corinth, it was a capital of Achaia, which was an ancient Roman city. Now, before that, it was part of the Greek Empire. Alexander the Great had taken Corinth and made it a major city. And so, for a long time, it was under Greek rule. And as Rome kept expanding its empire, it eventually moves into the Greek territories. And Corinth was one of those first cities. Under Julius Caesar, if you know that guy, he's the one who gets assassinated, right? He conquered Corinth. And so the people and the architecture of the place was very Greek influenced. But then Rome, when they come in, they offer a lot of new sort of Roman technologies like aqueducts, and all their infrastructures and all their buildings tended to be this sort of weird blend between ancient Greek culture and now this new Roman culture, which had some similarities but some very distinct differences. So the people would have been educated in the Greek way of life and philosophy and teachings and everything else, but then still under Roman rule. Now the population was actually made up of a lot of retired Roman soldiers. It's kind of like the Florida of its time, where people go to retire. It's nice, it's on the coast, it's beautiful, and so people who had maybe served a whole life of serving in the Roman Empire now are spending their last days in retirement in Corinth. And so a large portion of the people that were living at that time when Paul writes this letter are retired soldiers who would have been very loyal to the Romans in the Roman Empire. The population also had a large group of Jews as well that would have been living there. And so the congregation that Paul's writing to would have been very similar kind of to the Roman congregation, which was a blended Greek and Gentile and Jewish Christian congregation. So some of the stuff that we talked about with Romans is going to kind of apply here. Whenever Paul is talking about some of the disputes within the church and the way that they do worship and all these little picky things that they fight over, Paul's going to have some similar words to say. So it could be a little bit tricky at times to kind of differentiate the difference between what Romans said and what Corinthians says, but we'll talk about them when we get there. The other thing you need to know is that Corinth itself as a city was very religious. If you would have walked in the streets of Corinth at the time where Paul was there, you would have seen shrines and pagan statues pretty much everywhere of all the Greek and the Roman gods and goddesses. And so, for many, if you weren't part of the Christian church, it would have maybe been seen as this whole Jesus thing people were doing, this whole Christian thing, that was just another religion added on to everything. So for the average Corinthian, it probably didn't really register that Christians were any different until they started doing radically different things and getting arrested for it and getting persecuted for that. This is one of the challenges that Paul faces, a culture that is so embedded in the way things used to always be with these pagan worshiping services and all the shrines and to gods and goddesses and so on, but helping people see the true God in the midst of all that nonsense. Now, I mentioned that a lot of the citizens would have been Roman soldiers, like retired Roman soldiers. And there was actually a cult that had begun that was worshiping the emperor himself. And many of those devotees to that cult were Roman soldiers. And so, one of the main themes that we've talked about with Paul's letters is that he talks about that as Jesus as Lord. that there was no one above Jesus, not even Caesar, right? And so there would have been some clash, some beliefs that would have not mixed well with Paul's beliefs and the church beliefs compared to these Corinthians and the Romans. You know, for people maybe who were devoted to this emperor worship and this way of life, Caesar's Lord. Yeah, Jesus was maybe okay, but he's not the best, and he's not above everyone. They would have viewed Caesar as Lord. And so there's no room for that in the church. There's no room for anyone to be above Jesus, especially not Caesar. And so some of the tensions that you're going to be reading here in Corinthians is about that. It's a struggle between who is Lord and who should we worship. All right, that's going to do it for our today's lecture, just as an introduction to the background of the letter of 1st and 2nd Corinthians. In our next one, we'll talk about some more of the details in the book itself, and you'll have some reading and so on. Please respond to the questions that are here below the video, and I'll catch you in the next one.